There is a moment in every person's life when the world they thought they understood completely falls apart. When the confidence they spent years building gets stripped away in a matter of days, when the certainty they wore like armor turns out to be nothing more than arrogance dressed up as intelligence. For most people, that moment becomes the end of the story, the point at which they quietly retreat, lower their ambitions, and spend the rest of their lives explaining why things did not work out the way they planned. For Ray Dalio, that moment became the beginning of everything. The beginning of a philosophy, a fortune, and a way of understanding the world that would eventually make him one of the most respected and most studied investors in human history. But to understand what he built, you first have to understand what he lost. And to understand what he lost, you have to go back to the beginning, to a kid from a modest neighborhood in New York who fell in love with something that most people his age had never even thought about, and who would spend the next 6 decades turning that love into one of the most remarkable careers in the history of modern finance. The neighborhood where Raymond Thomas Dalio grew up was not the kind of place that produces many billionaires. Jackson Heights, Queens, in the 1950s and early 1960s, was a working-class community where fathers went to work in the morning and came home tired in the evening, where mothers managed households with careful attention to what things cost, and where ambition was generally defined in terms of security rather than greatness. Ray's father was a jazz musician, a profession that embodied a particular kind of artistic freedom, but did not come with the financial predictability that most families in Jackson Heights would have considered desirable. His mother stayed home and raised the family. By any conventional measure, the Dalio household was not a place where a future hedge fund billionaire was being quietly prepared for world domination. What it was, though, was a place where a particular kind of mind could develop without too much interference. Ray was not a standout student in the academic sense. He has been candid about this in interviews and in his writing, describing himself as someone who found it difficult to memorize things or to absorb information presented in the conventional ways that schools reward. What he could do, and what he found deeply satisfying in a way that classroom work rarely provided, was understand things. Not remember them, but genuinely understand them. There is a difference, and it matters more than most educational systems acknowledge. You can memorize the date of a historical event without understanding why it happened. You can remember a formula without understanding the principle behind it. Ray Dalio was, from a very early age, someone who was far more interested in the why than the what, far more compelled by causes than by facts, far more energized by understanding how systems worked than by cataloging their outputs. He caddied at a golf course as a 12-year-old, which is how he first came into contact with the kind of men who talked casually about things he had never heard discussed at home. Investments, markets, stocks, the names of companies and what they were worth and why they might be worth more or less next year. He was curious in the way that 12-year-olds are curious when they encounter a world that is entirely new to them, not with the focused intensity of someone who already knows what they want, but with the open, slightly bewildered attention of someone who senses that something important is happening and wants to understand what it is. He used the money he earned caddying to buy his first stock, shares in Northeast Airlines, which he chose primarily because it was the only company he had heard of that cost less than $5 per share. The airline subsequently merged with another company, and the value of his shares tripled. Ray Dalio made money on his very first investment, not because of any particular insight or skill, but because of the specific and unrepeatable circumstances of a single corporate transaction. He would spend years before fully understanding the difference between skill and luck, between a process that works reliably and a result that happened to turn out well. But that first experience, that early taste of what markets could do, was enough to create an appetite that would define the rest of his life. By the time he entered high school, he was reading everything he could find about investing and markets. Not the simplified, reassuring kind of financial writing that tells people how to save for retirement, but the more complicated and intellectually demanding kind that tries to explain how economies actually function, how money flows through systems, how the decisions of millions of individuals and institutions aggregate into the patterns we call markets. He was developing, without fully recognizing it yet, the habit of thinking at multiple levels simultaneously, of looking at a stock price and asking not just whether it was going up or down, but why. Not just what the company was worth today, but what forces would determine what it was worth 5 years from now. Most people who invest think about what is happening. Ray Dalio was learning to think about what is happening and why and what that implies about what will happen next. It is a different cognitive habit entirely, and developing it takes years of deliberate practice that most people never undertake, because the immediate returns on intellectual investment are invisible in a way that the immediate returns on buying a stock are not. He attended Long Island University and then went on to Harvard Business School, where he graduated with an MBA in 1972. The Harvard credential was useful, and the network it provided would matter later in ways he could not yet anticipate. But the most important things Dalio learned during his educational years were not things that appeared on any syllabus. They were things he learned by reading voraciously outside of whatever he was supposed to be studying, by thinking about markets and economies and human behavior during the hours that his classmates spent on other activities, by developing the intellectual habits that would eventually allow him to construct what he would later call his mental models, his frameworks for understanding how the world actually worked as opposed to how it was conventionally described. After business school, he went to work on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, where he traded commodity futures. The experience of being on a trading floor, surrounded by the immediate visceral energy of markets in motion, was formative in a way that no amount of reading or studying could have replicated. Markets, seen from the inside, are not the rational, efficient mechanisms that textbooks sometimes suggest. They are human institutions, shaped by human psychology, driven by human emotion, and subject to the full spectrum of human irrationality that shows up whenever money is involved in any significant way. Fear makes people sell things that they should keep. Greed makes people buy things that they should avoid. Crowd behavior creates momentum that carries prices far above or far below what any careful analysis of underlying value would support. These were not abstract observations for Dalio. They were things he watched happen every day, sometimes within minutes, as traders around him made decisions based on information and instinct and emotion in proportions that varied constantly and were never fully transparent. He moved to Shearson Hayden Stone, a brokerage firm, and then made a move that reflected the confidence and the ambition that were increasingly defining how he operated. He left the security of an established firm to start his own operation from the apartment he was living in, which later moved to a 2-bedroom apartment in New York. It was 1975, and Bridgewater Associates was born in conditions that were about as far from the gleaming headquarters of a major financial institution as it was possible to imagine. There was no team, no institutional backing, no track record that would distinguish this new venture from the dozens of other small investment operations that were being started and abandoned every year by people who believed they understood markets better than they actually did. What Dalio had was his accumulated years of thinking about how things worked, his emerging frameworks for analyzing economic patterns, and the particular kind of confidence that comes not from having been proven right many times, but from having thought things through so carefully that you believe your understanding is genuinely better than the consensus understanding of the market. That confidence in the early years of Bridgewater produced results that reinforced it. Dalio was making predictions about commodity prices and currency movements and economic trends that turned out to be correct with a frequency that began attracting the attention of corporations and other institutional clients who wanted his analysis. He was not simply saying that prices would go up or down. He was explaining why, constructing causal arguments that trace the links between government policy decisions and currency movements, between agricultural conditions and commodity prices, between credit expansion and economic growth in ways that made his conclusions feel more grounded in real understanding than the typical market commentary that his clients were used to receiving. He was young, he was confident, and he was building a track record that seemed to confirm that his particular way of thinking about markets was genuinely superior to the conventional approaches. And then came 1982, and everything changed. Dalio had become convinced, on the basis of careful analysis of debt levels, credit conditions, and economic indicators, that the United States economy was heading toward a severe depression. Not a mild recession of the kind that the economy experienced periodically, but a genuine, catastrophic contraction that would rival the Great Depression of the 1930s in its severity. He made this prediction publicly and repeatedly. He positioned his clients accordingly. He appeared on television and testified before Congress, warning that economic catastrophe was imminent and that urgent action was needed to prevent it. He was not hedging his views or qualifying them with the kind of careful uncertainty that most analysts attach to predictions about complex systems. He was certain. He had done the analysis. He understood what was happening. He could see what was coming. He was sure of it in a way that left no meaningful room for the possibility that he might be wrong. The economy did not collapse. Mexico defaulted on its debt, which had been one of the specific triggers Dalio had identified as a potential catalyst for broader economic crisis, but instead of spreading into the systemic collapse he had predicted, the Federal Reserve responded with policy interventions that contained the damage. Markets, instead of crashing as Dalio had predicted, began one of the longest bull market runs in American history. The Dow Jones, instead of plummeting as his analysis suggested it should, rose dramatically over the following years, rewarding the investors who had stayed positioned for growth and punishing those who had positioned themselves for catastrophe. Dalio lost money. His clients lost money. The firm lost clients. The credibility he had spent years building in the financial community was devastated by the specificity and the confidence of a prediction that had turned out to be completely wrong. He had to let the small team he had assembled go. He had to borrow money from his father to pay his own bills. He was at one of the most visible and consequential points in his professional life, publicly, unmistakably, and completely wrong. Not slightly off in timing, not correct about the direction but wrong about the magnitude, but genuinely, fundamentally wrong in his analysis of what was happening and what was about to happen. This is the moment in Ray Dalio's story where most narratives skip quickly to the recovery, to the rebuilding, to the eventual triumph that makes the early failure seem like a necessary and manageable episode on the road to success. But pausing here and examining what this moment actually felt like and what it actually required is important, because the way Dalio responded to this specific crisis is the single most important event in his entire story. More important than any investment decision he ever made. More important than any client he ever won. More important than any trade that ever worked out exactly as he predicted. Because what happened inside him after 1982 is what actually built the fortune and the philosophy that define his legacy. The immediate experience was devastation. Not just financial devastation, though that was real and serious, but the deeper, more personal devastation of having been completely wrong about something you were completely certain about. Dalio has written and spoken about this with unusual directness, describing the humiliation of having been publicly wrong. The disorientation of discovering that his understanding of how markets worked was less complete and less reliable than he had believed, and the particular difficulty of separating the question of what went wrong from the ego-protecting narrative that the mind naturally constructs to explain failure as the result of external circumstances rather than personal error. Most people, when they fail in a public and significant way, go through a predictable emotional sequence. The initial shock gives way to a kind of defensive rationalization in which the failure gets attributed to bad luck, to unfair circumstances, to the unpredictable behavior of others, to anything that protects the story the person tells about themselves from requiring fundamental revision. The story that you are basically competent, that your judgment is basically sound, that the failure was an aberration rather than a revelation, is deeply comforting and deeply dangerous at the same time. It is comforting because it allows you to preserve your self-image without the painful work of actually examining what went wrong. It is dangerous because it prevents the learning that would allow you to do better next time. Dalio went through the initial shock, but he did not settle into the defensive rationalization. Instead, he forced himself to ask the question that the defensive narrative is specifically designed to help you avoid. What if I'm the problem? Not what if I was unlucky, or what if the circumstances were unusually difficult, or what if other people made mistakes that contributed to the outcome? What if the analysis was wrong? What if the thinking process that produced the prediction was flawed in ways that I did not recognize? What if my confidence was not evidence of sound understanding, but evidence of the specific cognitive trap known as overconfidence, the tendency to be more certain about complex predictions than any realistic assessment of the underlying uncertainty would justify? These are genuinely difficult questions to sit with, because they require entertaining the possibility that the identity you have constructed around your own intelligence and capability is not fully accurate. For someone who had built his professional identity around the quality of his economic analysis, around his ability to see things that other market participants missed, the possibility that his analysis was not as reliable as he had believed was not just an intellectual challenge. It was an existential one. It threatened the story that organized his sense of who he was and what he was capable of. And facing that threat honestly, without retreating into the defensive narratives that would have been much more psychologically comfortable, required a kind of courage that has nothing to do with the physical kind, and everything to do with the willingness to see yourself clearly, even when what you see is uncomfortable. What emerged from Dalio's extended and painful reckoning with his 1982 failure was a set of principles that he would spend the rest of his career refining, testing, and applying. The first and most foundational of these principles was the recognition that being wrong was not the problem. Everyone is wrong sometimes, especially when trying to predict the behavior of complex systems like economies and markets. The problem was being wrong while being certain, failing to account for the realistic possibility that his analysis might be incomplete or flawed in ways he had not yet recognized. The corrective to this specific problem was not to become less willing to make predictions. It was to become much more systematic about understanding the limitations of any prediction, about identifying the specific assumptions on which the prediction depended, and assessing how confident he could actually be in each of those assumptions. He began developing what he called a systematic approach to decision-making, a process for thinking about investments and economic predictions that was explicit and documented rather than intuitive and internal. Instead of reaching a conclusion through a reasoning process that existed primarily in his own mind and was therefore difficult to examine or challenge, he started writing down his thinking, articulating the specific assumptions behind every major prediction, identifying the evidence that would tell him whether those assumptions were correct, and building in explicit mechanisms for updating his views when the evidence suggested they needed to change. This process, which sounds straightforward when described abstractly, is actually quite difficult to implement consistently, because the natural pressure of markets and deadlines and client expectations creates constant incentive to shortcut the rigorous analysis in favor of faster, more intuitive conclusions. The second principle that emerged from the 1982 experience was what Dalio called radical open-mindedness, the active, deliberate practice of seeking out people and perspectives that challenged his thinking rather than confirming it. One of the structural weaknesses of any expert's thinking is the tendency to surround yourself with people who share your framework, who approach problems the same way you do, who are likely to reach similar conclusions from similar evidence. This creates a particular kind of collective blind spot, where the specific assumptions that everyone in a group shares go unexamined because no one in the group thinks to challenge them. Dalio recognized, after 1982, that his thinking about the economy had been shaped by a specific set of assumptions about how credit and debt worked that he had never seriously stress-tested against alternative frameworks. The people around him had largely shared those assumptions, which meant the built-in error correction mechanism of having smart people disagree with you had not been functioning effectively. The solution was not simply to hire people who disagreed with him for the sake of disagreement. It was to create an environment in which the quality of ideas, rather than the status of the person who held them, determined which ideas got taken seriously. This is much harder than it sounds, because in any organization, seniority, reputation, and confidence create an implicit hierarchy of credibility that distorts the information environment in predictable ways. Junior people do not challenge senior people even when they have good reasons to, because the social and professional cost of being wrong in a public challenge to authority is very high, while the benefit of being right accrues primarily to the organization rather than to the individual who raised the challenge. Dalio wanted to build an organization where that calculus was reversed, where the cost of not raising a well-reasoned challenge was higher than the cost of raising it, and where being right was valued far more than being senior. He called this radical transparency, and it became the foundation of the culture he built at Bridgewater Associates as the firm grew from his two-bedroom apartment into the largest hedge fund in the world. The specific mechanics of radical transparency at Bridgewater have been described and debated extensively, and they have attracted both admiring commentary from people who see them as a genuine organizational innovation and critical commentary from people who have found the culture they create extremely uncomfortable to work in. But the underlying logic, the belief that organizations make better decisions when the information environment is honest rather than filtered by hierarchy and status, is both coherent and supported by substantial evidence from research on how groups make decisions under uncertainty. Rebuilding Bridgewater. After 1982 was not a quick process. It took years of careful, deliberate work to rebuild the credibility that the failed prediction had damaged, years of delivering genuine value to clients through a combination of sound analysis and honest communication about uncertainty. Years of refining the systematic decision-making processes that had emerged from the painful lessons of the failure. During this period, Dalio developed something that became one of the most important intellectual products he would ever create, a conceptual framework for understanding how economies work that he would eventually call the economic machine.
The core insight of this framework was that economies could be understood as the aggregate result of a relatively small number of fundamental transactions, repeated billions of times across all the participants in an economic system. Credit, specifically, was the mechanism that allowed spending to exceed income in the short term, which was the driver of economic cycles. When credit was expanding, spending grew faster than income, which felt good and created optimism and further expansion. When credit contracted, spending fell below income, which felt bad and created pessimism and further contraction. The cycles of expansion and contraction were not random or unpredictable. They followed patterns that could be analyzed and anticipated if you understood the underlying mechanics of how credit creation and destruction worked. This framework, which Dalio has since made publicly available in an animated video that has been viewed tens of millions of times, was not entirely original. The role of credit in economic cycles had been recognized by economists before Dalio articulated it. What was distinctive about his contribution was the way he operationalized the framework, turning it from an abstract theoretical insight into a practical tool for making investment decisions with real money under real uncertainty. He was not content to understand how economies worked in a general academic sense. He wanted to understand them well enough to know what was likely to happen next, with a degree of precision and reliability that could serve as the basis for investment decisions that would generate returns for his clients over long periods. The testing and refinement of this framework, conducted through the 1980s and 1990s using real trades with real money in real markets, gradually produced a track record that was genuinely impressive by any reasonable measure. Bridgewater's flagship fund, the Pure Alpha Fund, delivered returns that consistently outperformed market averages while maintaining lower volatility, meaning clients were getting better results while taking less risk than the market as a whole. This combination is the holy grail of investment management, and it attracted the kind of institutional clients, sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, university endowments that were looking for exactly this profile. As the client base grew, so did the assets under management. And as the assets under management grew, so did the firm's resources for research, analysis, and talent acquisition, creating a compounding dynamic that would eventually make Bridgewater the largest hedge fund in the world. But the growth of assets and the growth of the firm created new challenges that were in some ways more difficult than the intellectual challenges of understanding markets. Managing a large organization is fundamentally different from managing a small one, not just in the obvious ways related to scale and complexity, but in the deeper sense that the information environment of a large organization is structurally different from the information environment of a small one. In a small organization, the people making decisions are often directly involved in the work being done, which means they have direct access to the information that is relevant to those decisions. In a large organization, the people making decisions are inevitably separated from the work by multiple layers of management, which means the information that reaches them has been filtered, summarized, and interpreted by people at each layer, often in ways that reflect the interests and perspectives of those people as much as the underlying reality being described. Dalio's response to this challenge was to extend the logic of radical transparency into the operational management of the firm, to create systems and processes that maintained the honest information environment he valued, even as the firm grew large enough that he could no longer be personally present in every important conversation. This meant recording virtually all meetings and making the recordings available across the organization, creating written documentation of decisions and the reasoning behind them that could be examined and challenged by anyone with a relevant perspective, and building explicit feedback mechanisms that allowed problems and disagreements to surface upward through the organization, rather than being suppressed by the natural tendency of people to tell their supervisors what they think the supervisors want to hear. The results of these practices, in terms of the quality of decision-making at Bridgewater, are difficult to measure, precisely because we do not have access to the counterfactual world in which Dalio had built a more conventionally managed organization. What we do know is that the firm's investment performance continued to be strong, through periods when many other hedge funds were struggling, that Bridgewater navigated the 2008 financial crisis in ways that were genuinely remarkable given the severity of the event, and that the institutional clients who have entrusted enormous amounts of capital to the firm have generally continued to do so over long periods, which is itself a form of evidence about the firm's reliability. The 2008 financial crisis deserves particular attention in any account of Ray Dalio's career, because it was the moment when the economic framework he had been developing for over 2 decades was tested against one of the most severe market disruptions of the modern era. The crisis, which began with the collapse of the American housing market and spread through the global financial system with terrifying speed, was not predicted by most market participants, most financial regulators, or most academic economists. The conventional view, supported by decades of relatively stable growth and by a set of beliefs about the self-correcting properties of modern financial markets, was that the specific kind of catastrophic systemic failure that actually occurred was either impossible or vanishingly unlikely. Dalio and Bridgewater saw it coming. Not because they had some kind of privileged access to information that was unavailable to others, but because their framework for analyzing credit cycles told them clearly what was happening and what was likely to happen next. The levels of debt that had accumulated in the American housing market and in the financial institutions that had created, packaged, and sold mortgage-related securities were unsustainable in the specific sense that they could not be serviced if housing prices stopped rising. And there was no credible reason to believe that housing prices would continue rising at the rates that would be necessary to service them. When the mechanism that had been keeping the debt serviceable stopped working, the deleveraging that followed would be severe, and its effects would spread through the financial system in predictable ways that the framework allowed Dalio to trace in advance. Bridgewater's Pure Alpha Fund was up significantly in 2008, the year when most investment funds were experiencing catastrophic losses. This performance, achieved in one of the most difficult market environments in modern history, transformed Dalio's reputation from that of a successful and respected investor to that of a genuinely exceptional one, someone whose understanding of markets and economies operated at a level that most participants in those markets could not match. The institutions that were managing pension funds and endowments and sovereign wealth wanted to understand how he had done it, and, more importantly, they wanted to ensure that they were positioned to benefit from his analysis in the future. Assets under management at Bridgewater continued to grow, eventually reaching levels that made the firm not just the largest hedge fund in the world, but one of the most influential financial institutions of any kind. But the public dimension of Dalio's influence, the reputation he was building outside the relatively closed world of institutional investment management, was growing through a different channel during these same years. He had been writing down his principles, the specific rules and frameworks that guided both his investment thinking and his approach to managing Bridgewater since the early years of rebuilding the firm after 1982. What had started as a practical tool for communicating his thinking to colleagues had grown, over decades of writing and refinement, into a comprehensive document that addressed not just investment decision-making, but the full range of challenges involved in building an organization, making good decisions under uncertainty, managing relationships, learning from failure, and thinking clearly about complex problems. In 2017, Dalio published this document as a book, simply titled Principles, and the response was remarkable. The book became a bestseller not because it offered the kind of simple, reassuring wisdom that characterizes most business advice books, but because it offered something genuinely more demanding and more useful. Dalio was not telling readers what they wanted to hear. He was telling them what he had learned, which included a great deal of uncomfortable information about the ways in which ordinary human psychology, the psychology that all of us share, is specifically poorly suited to making good decisions under uncertainty and in complex, rapidly changing environments. The book challenged readers to examine their own thinking processes honestly, to identify the specific cognitive habits and emotional patterns that were causing them to make worse decisions than they otherwise would, and to build systematic approaches to decision-making that could compensate for these inherent human limitations. The reception of the book revealed something interesting about the public appetite for genuinely demanding intellectual content in the domain of personal and professional development. The self-help industry is enormous, and most of its output follows a predictable formula in which the reader is told that success is achievable with relatively modest changes to existing behavior, that the main obstacle between them and the life they want is a small number of bad habits that can be replaced with good ones through techniques that are straightforward to implement. Dalio's approach was entirely different. He was essentially telling readers that they were probably wrong about many important things in ways they did not recognize, that their confidence in their own judgment was likely higher than the actual reliability of that judgment warranted, and that the work required to become a genuinely good decision-maker was substantial and ongoing, and never fully complete. This is not the kind of message that usually generates bestseller lists. It generated one anyway, which suggests that a significant number of people were hungry for exactly this kind of honest, demanding intellectual engagement. The later years of Dalio's career at Bridgewater were not without difficulty, and it would be a distortion of the full picture to present them as a smooth continuation of the earlier success. The culture of radical transparency that he had built, which had served the firm well in many respects, generated ongoing controversy and criticism both internally and externally. Former employees described an environment that some found genuinely transformative and others found genuinely oppressive. A culture in which the constant public evaluation of everyone's thinking and performance created an intensity that was productive for some people and deeply uncomfortable for others. The firm went through a significant leadership transition in the late 2000s, as Dalio gradually stepped back from day-to-day management responsibilities, and the process of transitioning the culture and the decision-making systems to a new generation of leaders raised real questions about whether the specific capabilities that had driven Bridgewater's success were embodied in the systems and processes the firm had built, or in the judgment of the specific individual who had created those systems. These questions are not unique to Bridgewater. They are questions that every organization built around an unusually capable founder eventually has to confront. The answer is almost never entirely satisfying, because the capabilities of extraordinary individuals are never fully transferable to organizational processes, however carefully designed. What can be transferred are the frameworks, the habits of thinking, the explicit principles that guided the decisions of the founding individual, along with a culture that takes those frameworks and habits seriously enough to apply them consistently, even when the specific circumstances being faced were not anticipated in the original design. Whether Bridgewater has succeeded in this transfer is a question that only the firm's future performance will fully answer. What is not in question is the significance of what Dalio built and what he contributed to the broader conversation about how to think about investing, organizations, and decision-making. The economic machine framework, which he has made freely available and which explains the mechanics of credit cycles with a clarity and accessibility that academic economics rarely achieves, has been watched by millions of people who would never have engaged with the same ideas presented in academic language. The principles he articulated, both in the document he shared with Bridgewater employees over decades and in the book he published in 2017, have influenced a generation of investors, entrepreneurs, and leaders who have found in them a more honest and more demanding framework for thinking about success than most of what the self-improvement industry typically offers. The specific investment insights that shaped Bridgewater's approach, particularly the recognition that diversification across uncorrelated assets could reduce risk without proportionally reducing returns, gave rise to what Dalio called the all-weather portfolio, an asset allocation framework that has been adopted in various forms by institutional and individual investors around the world. The underlying logic is elegant in its simplicity, even though the implementation requires careful analysis. Different types of assets, stocks, bonds, commodities, inflation-protected securities, respond differently to the two fundamental economic variables of growth and inflation. By holding a mix of assets that are specifically selected for their different sensitivities to these variables, an investor can build a portfolio that performs reasonably well across the full range of economic environments, rather than performing well in some environments and catastrophically in others. This insight, which came from Dalio's years of thinking about economic cycles and what drives asset prices through those cycles, has become one of the most widely cited frameworks in institutional investment management. Looking at the full arc of Ray Dalio's career and the philosophy that emerged from it, there are lessons that extend far beyond the specific domain of financial markets and investment management. Lessons that speak to fundamental questions about how to think well, how to learn effectively, and how to build organizations that are capable of sustained high performance over long periods. The first and most foundational of these lessons is about the relationship between confidence and accuracy. Dalio's 1982 failure was not a failure of intelligence or of effort. It was a failure of calibration, a systematic overestimate of his own certainty about a complex prediction. The humility he developed in response to that failure, the recognition that even very careful thinking can be very wrong about complex systems, did not make him less willing to form strong views about markets and economies. It made him more rigorous about understanding the limits of those views, more systematic about identifying the assumptions on which they depended, and more disciplined about updating them when the evidence suggested they needed to change. The second lesson is about the specific value of failure as a source of information. Most people treat failure primarily as a negative event to be minimized, recovered from, and eventually forgotten. Dalio came to treat failure primarily as information to be extracted, analyzed, and incorporated into a more accurate model of how the world worked. This reframing does not make failure pleasant or easy to experience. What it does is change the relationship between failure and learning in a way that allows failure to make you better rather than simply worse. The person who treats every failure as primarily a source of shame and embarrassment loses most of the information value that the failure contains, because extracting that information requires honest examination of what went wrong and why, which is exactly what shame and the defensive narratives it generates make difficult. The third lesson is about the relationship between individual capability and organizational structure. Dalio was extraordinarily capable as an analyst and investor, but he recognized far earlier and more clearly than most founders do that individual capability has inherent limits, and that the organizations that perform at the highest level over long periods are the ones that have found ways to build the benefits of excellent individual judgment into organizational processes and cultures, that can function effectively even when no single individual has all the answers. This recognition drove his investment in the principles and systems at Bridgewater, the effort to make the firm's decision-making processes explicit, documentable, and therefore learnable and improvable, rather than leaving them as tacit knowledge that lived primarily in his own head and would be lost if he were no longer present. The fourth lesson is about the time horizons over which learning and compounding actually operate. The investment philosophy that Dalio developed, the economic machine framework, the all-weather portfolio concept, the systematic approach to decision-making. None of these were built quickly. They were built over decades of careful thinking, testing, refinement, and honest assessment of what was working and what was not. The returns on this kind of intellectual investment are invisible in the short term and enormous in the long term, which is exactly why most people underinvest in it. It is much easier to measure the return on a single trade than the return on a decade of developing a better framework for thinking about markets. The former appears on a monthly performance statement. The latter only reveals itself over the kind of time horizon that most people find it genuinely difficult to think about. As we approach the conclusion of this story, it is worth stepping back from the specific details of Ray Dalio's career and his philosophy to consider the broader question that his life actually answers. What does it actually take to perform at an extraordinary level, in investing or in any other domain, over a very long period of time? The conventional narrative, the one that fills business bestsellers and motivational content, emphasizes talent, hard work, and the willingness to take risks. These things matter, but Dalio's story suggests that they are not the most important factors. The most important factor seems to be something rarer and harder to develop: the willingness to be genuinely honest with yourself about what you do not know, about where your thinking is unreliable, about the ways in which the very certainty that makes you feel confident is often the clearest signal that you should be asking more questions rather than acting on your current conclusions.
This is a demanding and, in some ways, uncomfortable message. It asks you to hold your own intelligence and your own judgment more lightly than most people naturally do, to maintain a kind of permanent epistemic humility that feels at odds with the confident decisiveness that we typically associate with successful people. But Dalio's career is itself the evidence that this kind of humility, far from making you less effective, actually makes you more so. The willingness to be wrong, to examine your mistakes honestly, to update your views when the evidence demands it, to seek out perspectives that challenge rather than confirm your existing thinking, these are not signs of weakness or indecision. They are the specific cognitive habits that allow a person to keep getting better at understanding a complex, constantly changing world, rather than locking in early on a set of beliefs and defending them against evidence that they are incomplete or incorrect. The billionaire who predicted crashes did not predict them through some mystical insight or preternatural market intuition. He predicted them by building, over decades of careful work and honest self-examination, a framework for understanding how economies worked that was simply more accurate and more complete than the frameworks that most other participants were working with. And he built that framework not by being brilliant in a vacuum, but by failing, examining those failures with genuine honesty, and incorporating what he learned from them into an ever more accurate and ever more useful model of the world he was trying to understand. There is a version of Ray Dalio's story in which the 1982 failure is a brief obstacle on the road to inevitable success, a character-building episode that makes the eventual triumph more dramatic without fundamentally changing its nature. That version is much tidier than the actual story and much less useful. The actual story is one in which the failure was not incidental but essential, not just a test of character but the specific event that created the character being tested. Without the humiliation of 1982, without the years of painful, honest self-examination that followed it, without the principles and systems and habits of thinking that emerged from that reckoning, there would have been no Bridgewater at the scale it achieved, no economic machine framework, no all-weather portfolio, no principles. There would have been a smart, successful investor who got a great deal right and some things wrong, which describes many people. Instead, there was something much rarer, a person whose greatest failure became the foundation of their greatest contribution. That is the real story of Ray Dalio. Not the predictions that turned out to be right, impressive as some of them were, not the billions of dollars managed and the institutional clients served and the accolades accumulated over decades of a remarkable career. The real story is the decision made in the aftermath of devastating failure to ask the hardest possible question honestly, and to keep asking it every day for the rest of a working life. What if I'm wrong? What if my thinking is less reliable than I believe? What am I missing? What would I need to see to change my mind? These questions, applied with genuine rigor and genuine intellectual honesty over long enough periods, turn out to be among the most powerful tools a human being can use to understand a complex world. And the person who demonstrated this most clearly, whose career is the most compelling argument for the specific value of calibrated humility in the face of genuine uncertainty, is a kid from Jackson Heights, Queens, who learned to love markets at a golf course in the 1960s and spent the next 6 decades trying to understand them clearly enough to tell the truth about what they were doing and where they were going. If this story changed the way you think about failure, about learning, about the real source of extraordinary long-term performance, then you already have the most valuable thing we can offer here. Subscribe to Billion Dollar Stories for more explorations like this one, more deep examinations of the real decisions and the real character behind the world's most extraordinary business careers. Leave a comment below telling us which part of Ray Dalio's story hit you hardest, which lesson you are going to carry with you from this video. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and we will see you in the next one. There is something worth exploring more carefully about the specific intellectual environment in which Ray Dalio developed his thinking, because the context in which a mind forms is never incidental to the kind of thinking that mind eventually produces. The financial world of the 1970s and 1980s, the period during which Dalio was building the foundational frameworks that would define his career, was in the middle of a transformation that was reshaping the entire profession of investment management. The academic work on efficient markets, on the relationship between risk and return, on portfolio theory and options pricing, was making its way from university economics departments into the actual practice of investment management, changing the language and the conceptual frameworks that practitioners used to think about what they were doing and why. Dalio was aware of this work and engaged with it seriously, but his relationship to academic economics was always the relationship of a practitioner rather than a theorist. He cared about what actually worked, about frameworks that could generate reliable predictions about real markets under real conditions with real money on the line, and he was willing to discard elegant theoretical structures when they conflicted with the messy reality of how markets actually behaved. This practical orientation created a particular kind of intellectual independence that was both a strength and a source of occasional friction with the financial establishment. Academic economists and market theorists have sometimes been skeptical of Dalio's frameworks, finding them too simple or too mechanistic to capture the genuine complexity of economic systems. Practitioners who have operated purely on intuition and experience without building explicit analytical frameworks have sometimes found his systematic approach overly rigid. Dalio's position, sustained across decades of evidence, has been that the pragmatic test is the only relevant one. Does the framework actually work, measured in real investment returns over real-time periods under real market conditions? The answer, in Bridgewater's case, has been sufficiently affirmative to make the theoretical objections largely irrelevant in practical terms. The development of what became Bridgewater's most distinctive investment products grew from this pragmatic orientation combined with the specific insights of the economic machine framework. The Pure Alpha Fund, which sought to generate returns that were genuinely uncorrelated with the overall market rather than simply amplified versions of market returns, required building a systematic approach to identifying mispricings across a very wide range of markets and asset classes simultaneously. Most investment funds generate returns that are heavily correlated with the overall market, meaning that they do well when markets are doing well and poorly when markets are doing poorly. The value added by such funds, the genuine alpha in the language of investment professionals, is often quite small compared to the overall return, most of which would have been generated simply by holding a passive index investment. Dalio's ambition was to build a process that could identify and capture genuine mispricing systematically enough that the returns it generated would not depend on the overall direction of markets. This was an enormously ambitious goal that required not just sound economic analysis, but sophisticated risk management, careful portfolio construction, and the kind of disciplined, systematic process that could operate consistently through market environments that created strong emotional pressure to deviate from the plan. The all-weather portfolio emerged from a different but related question, one that was in some ways more fundamental than the question of how to generate alpha. What asset allocation would allow an investor to maintain acceptable performance across the full range of economic environments that were historically possible, rather than performing well only in some environments and catastrophically in others? This question was motivated by Dalio's recognition that investors, especially institutional investors managing money on behalf of beneficiaries like pension fund participants, could not afford to experience the kind of catastrophic drawdowns that resulted from being heavily exposed to assets that performed well in some economic environments but disastrously in others. A pension fund that lost 40% of its value in a severe recession had done serious, potentially irreversible damage to the people depending on it, even if the fund eventually recovered completely on a long-term basis. The insight that solved this problem, or at least substantially ameliorated it, was the recognition that different asset classes had systematically different sensitivities to the two fundamental economic variables of growth and inflation. Stocks generally performed well when growth was strong and inflation was moderate. Bonds generally performed well when growth was weak and inflation was low. Commodities generally performed well when inflation was high. Inflation-protected securities provided a hedge against unexpected inflation regardless of growth conditions. By constructing a portfolio that was explicitly balanced across these different sensitivity profiles, an investor could build something that would not perform brilliantly in any single environment, but would perform adequately across all of them, which for many investors was a far more valuable characteristic than the alternative of performing brilliantly sometimes and disastrously other times. The specific asset allocation of the all-weather portfolio has been described and discussed in considerable detail in financial media and investment literature, and the various implementations of the concept by different investors and institutions have produced varied results depending on the specific time periods and market conditions involved. What matters more than the specific numbers is the underlying logic, which represents a genuine contribution to how investors and institutions can think about the relationship between asset allocation, risk, and the uncertainty of economic environments. The concept of explicitly designing a portfolio around economic scenarios rather than simply optimizing for historical return patterns was not entirely new when Dalio articulated it, but his formulation of it was clear, practical, and grounded in the economic machine framework in ways that made it genuinely accessible to practitioners. Beyond the specific investment products and frameworks, the organizational innovations Dalio introduced at Bridgewater have received substantial and sustained attention from people interested in management, organizational design, and the psychology of decision-making in groups. The practice of recording meetings, of documenting decisions and the reasoning behind them, of creating explicit processes for surfacing and resolving disagreements. These practices collectively represent an attempt to solve what is genuinely one of the most difficult problems in organizational management: the problem of maintaining the quality of decision-making as organizations grow and the information environment necessarily becomes more complex and more mediated by hierarchy. The challenge is structural. In a small organization, the people making important decisions are usually the same people doing the underlying work, which means they have direct access to the information and the context that should inform those decisions. As organizations grow, the separation between decision makers and the work they are directing increases, and the quality of the information reaching decision makers depends heavily on the communication processes through which that information travels. In most organizations, these communication processes are heavily influenced by social dynamics, by the desire of subordinates to tell superiors what they want to hear, by the reluctance of individuals at any level to surface information that reflects badly on themselves or their teams, by the various ways in which organizational politics distort the honest transmission of information about what is actually happening. The result is that decisions at the top of organizations are often made on the basis of information that is systematically biased in ways that the decision makers themselves cannot easily detect. Dalio's solution, implemented through the various transparency mechanisms at Bridgewater, was to try to make the information environment at the firm as honest as possible by reducing the social costs of honest communication and increasing the social costs of dishonest communication. If meetings were recorded, the content of those meetings could be reviewed, and claims about what was said and what was agreed could be verified against the actual record rather than relying on potentially distorted memories or self-serving accounts. If disagreements were required to be surfaced explicitly rather than suppressed or managed through informal channels, the actual range of views within the organization about important questions would be visible to people making decisions rather than being hidden by the tendency of organizational hierarchies to communicate consensus even when genuine consensus does not exist. The results of these practices, in terms of the quality of decision-making at Bridgewater, are genuinely difficult to disentangle from the other factors that have contributed to the firm's success. What is clear is that the practices created an environment that was, by the accounts of people who worked there, quite different from the environment at most financial firms, different in ways that some found deeply valuable and others found genuinely difficult to function within. This range of experiences is itself informative. The practices that Dalio implemented were not designed to be comfortable. They were designed to be effective, and effectiveness sometimes requires accepting discomfort that arises from honest information rather than comfortable information. The question of whether the Bridgewater culture is replicable, whether other organizations can implement the same practices and achieve the same quality of decision-making, is one that management researchers and practitioners have thought about extensively since the firm's approach became widely known. The answer is probably that the practices are replicable in form, but not necessarily in impact, because the specific way they operate in any organization depends heavily on the specific people implementing them and the specific context in which they are operating. Radical transparency works at Bridgewater in part because the firm was built around it from the beginning, because the people who have stayed at the firm over long periods have self-selected for the ability to function in that kind of environment, and because the principles underlying the practices have been refined over decades by people who understood both their purpose and their limitations. Grafting similar practices onto an organization with a different history, different culture, and different people would require careful adaptation rather than simple imitation. What does transfer? And what has transferred through the influence of Dalio's writing and speaking on the broader community of investors and managers is the underlying philosophy rather than the specific practices. The recognition that organizational decision-making is systematically distorted by hierarchical dynamics and ego-protecting behaviors, and that addressing these distortions requires deliberate structural interventions rather than simply exhorting people to be more honest, is a genuinely important insight that has influenced organizational design thinking well beyond the investment management industry. The specific interventions will vary with context, but the problem they are designed to address is universal. Ray Dalio's public writing about macroeconomics in the years following the publication of Principles has extended his influence into domains that are even further from the narrow world of hedge fund management. His analysis of the changing world order, examining the historical patterns through which dominant global powers have risen, peaked, and declined, and drawing parallels between those historical patterns and the current trajectory of American and Chinese economic and political power, has attracted both substantial readership and substantial controversy. The analytical framework he brings to this question is recognizable as an extension of the same approach he has applied to investment questions throughout his career, looking for deep patterns in historical data, identifying the causal mechanisms that explain those patterns, and using those mechanisms to generate predictions about future trajectories. The predictions he has made about the relative trajectories of American and Chinese power, about the sustainability of American debt levels, and about the long-term implications of the current global monetary system have been controversial in ways that his investment analysis has sometimes also been controversial. He has been accused of being too sympathetic to Chinese governance and too pessimistic about American prospects. He has defended his analysis as an attempt to examine these questions with the same kind of honest, evidence-based rigor that he has tried to apply to investment questions, without the partisan commitments that he believes distort most public discussion of geopolitical and economic trends. Whether his analysis of these large-scale questions is ultimately correct will be determined by events that are still unfolding and that will continue to unfold for decades. What is clear is that the approach he brings to these questions is consistent with the approach he has brought to every intellectual challenge throughout his career. The same insistence on explicit frameworks, the same emphasis on historical patterns and causal mechanisms, the same willingness to reach conclusions that challenge conventional wisdom when the evidence supports those conclusions, and the same openness, at least in principle, to updating those conclusions when new evidence demands it. The legacy of a career like Dalio's is difficult to summarize without either overstating it or understating it. He built the largest hedge fund in the world, which is a significant achievement by any measure. He developed investment frameworks that have influenced how institutional investors around the world think about asset allocation and risk management, which represents a genuine and lasting contribution to the practice of investment management. He articulated a philosophy of decision-making and organizational design that has attracted enormous attention and sparked productive debate about how organizations can make better decisions under uncertainty, which represents a contribution to management thinking that extends well beyond the investment industry. And he demonstrated, through the specific arc of his own career, that the willingness to be honestly wrong and to learn from failure can be the foundation of extraordinary long-term performance, which is perhaps the most broadly applicable lesson of all. None of these achievements came easily or quickly. None of them were guaranteed by the intelligence and ambition that Dalio brought to his work. They were built through decades of patient, disciplined effort, through the willingness to examine failures honestly and to incorporate the lessons from them systematically, through the creation of organizational structures and processes that could sustain high-quality decision-making across the inevitable personnel and leadership transitions of a long institutional history, and through the consistent application of intellectual humility that recognized the limits of any individual's knowledge and the importance of building in mechanisms to compensate for those limits. The boy from Jackson Heights who bought his first stock with caddy money at age 12, who built a firm in his apartment and watched it nearly destroyed by his own overconfidence, who spent decades reconstructing his understanding of how markets worked and how organizations should be designed, ultimately became not just a successful investor, but a genuine contributor to how we collectively think about decision-making under uncertainty. That contribution is available to anyone willing to engage with it seriously, in the books and speeches and frameworks he has made public over decades of intellectual productivity. Whether you are an investor trying to improve your approach to markets, a manager trying to build a better decision-making environment in your organization, or simply someone trying to think more clearly about a complex and uncertain world, the core of what Dalio learned and taught is both accessible and genuinely useful. The only thing it requires is the same thing it required of him: the willingness to take your own limitations seriously, to examine your mistakes honestly, and to keep learning long after most people have decided they already know enough. Subscribe to $Billion Stories and join us every week as we go this deep into the real stories, the real decisions, and the real lessons behind the people and the companies that changed the world. Comment below with the single biggest thing you are taking away from Ray Dalio's story. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and we will see you in the next one.